I'm Andrew Milne, and you're listening to the Celtic Soul Podcast.
A big shout out to our sponsors of this podcast, Pitch Publishing. If you get over to celticfanzine.com, you'll find a link to all their books, including, I guess, today's book, John Wight's Jungle Days. You'll find books on Alfie Conn, Rudy Vanta, Jackie McNamara, Ange Postecoglou, Jock Stein, and many others, including Fergus McCann versus David Murray, and Celtic versus Rangers, the Hoops 50 finest Old Firm Derby Day triumphs. And that's a David Potter book. And David, who was an esteemed writer with us here in the fanzine, and also a brilliant guest so many times on the podcast. We do miss David very much since his sad passing. And he's a number of books here on with Pitch Publishing, including the one I just spoke about, Celtic versus Rangers, also one on the Scottish Cup, 1967. He's got a book on facts and figures for every day of the year, Celtic Cult Heroes, and Celtic's Greatest Games. So plenty from Dave and plenty from a number of authors here on the Pitch Publishing Amazon shop. You'll also find everything to do on their own website at Pitch Publishing. So folks, once again, if you know anybody who would like to sponsor us to keep the ship afloat, please get in contact at info@celticfanzine.com. And once again, thank you very much to Pitch Publishing. Enjoy the podcast. Hello, folks. You're all very welcome back to the Celtic Soul Podcast. I'm Andrew Milne, and today on the podcast, my special guest is John Wight, author of Jungle Days Celtic in the 80s. I started following Celtic in the late 80s, but this book takes you back to when John started following Celtic and takes you right through the 80s. It's beautifully written. It takes you into the history of the club. Some readers will agree with John, some won't. He doesn't mess around when it comes to the history and the politics of the club. But in each chapter of the games he attends, if you're a regular traveller, he transports you back to that game. John, congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's great to be with you.
It's as I said, it's a beautiful read.
Thank you. Lovely to hear that.
Look, before we get into chatting to you, John, I just want to get the viewers, if they're on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button. And if you want to know what we're all about, visit celticfanzine.com and you'll find everything we do there across print, digital, audio and video. So, and if you're on audio, you're welcome and thanks for listening. John, take us back to your young history, who you are, where you're from, and your history in writing.
Well, I'm from Stockton Mains, which is a housing scheme on the west side of Edinburgh. Very working class, lower working class background. Grew up in a culture of low expectations. I left school just at the start of Thatcher's era. With all that involved, which was, it turned working class communities like mine upside down. Before she came along, working class people could expect to have a job for life, decent wage, decent prospects. Many working class families, they could live on one income. The father would go out to work, mother would look after the kids, very traditional. There was still something that you could describe as a community. People were involved in one another's lives. The mothers would take turns taking the kids to school. Then she changed all that in the name of the free market, which I lay out in the book, where it was every man and woman for themselves. And she brought in in my view, the cancer of competition and envy and people feeling that to be valid or to be validated, that they had to make money. Money was king. And what was lost in that dynamic was that sense of community. So my consciousness was raised when I got to the age of going to primary school, actually, because all my pals, most of my pals went to the state school or the Protestant school, state school, and I went to the Catholic school, half a mile away. Of course, I made new friends there, but suddenly I was different. And in the context and the backdrop of the Troubles that were still raging in the 80s at that time, and really fiercely, you'll recall the 1981 Irish hunger strikes, the temperature was raised enormously. And to the point where, I grew up at a point where I thought that my name was not John Wight, but Fenian Bastard or Catholic Cunt, because the sectarianism that I experienced, even in Edinburgh, And we can get into that, the role of Hibs as part of the model for Celtic in the late 19th century. So it did exist there. And Celtic became then a sanctuary for me. It became a sense of identity that I could be proud of, with people from the same background, with the same problems in life, a section of the working class. And the Catholic working class, let me make this point, Andrew, it's not divided by religion, it's divided by sectarianism, by the refusal of the entrenched culture of Orangism in Scotland, which still maintains to this day, maybe not as pronounced, but it's still there, to refuse to allow the assimilation of Catholics from an Irish background like myself. And Celtic is part of that process. They were formed on that basis, and in response to that sectarianism that Irish migrants experience, racism and bigotry. So, but my writing, to get on to the second part of your question, came about after I was in a car accident in northern Mexico. I was living in Los Angeles in the early 1990s. I broke my neck. I was up to no good in northern Mexico. You can imagine what that might be. I was very lucky to survive, of course, but I had a long year of convalescing, and then it took me off the hamster wheel, if you will, and I had a lot of time to think and contemplate life and my life and direction I was going in, direction I wanted to go in. And because I've been through such a life-changing experience, certainly psychologically, if not physically, I was so lucky to come out intact. I started to think more deeply about the world and, what the meaning of life and all this sort of stuff that a lot of people would normally find abstract and maybe irrelevant. It wasn't irrelevant to me because of what I'd been through. So I started to read, and I started to read some heavy books, philosophy and literature. And this was my process of self-education. This was obviously before Google. So I remember I would sit at the table and I would read these books, and I'd have a big Oxford English dictionary at my side and a journal. If I came across a word that I did not understand, which in those days was quite regularly, I would stop writing. I would look it up in the dictionary. I would write down the dictionary definition, and then I would proceed. And after I'd done that 2 or 3 times with the same word, then that word had become part of my own vocabulary. So then I started to feel that I wanted to tell my story in various guises. And the first thing I got published was a story of my broken neck and everything, arising from that was published in the FHM magazine. I don't think it any longer exists, FHM, but it was one of the men's magazines in the 90s. They had some quality writing in them, FHM, Arena, GQ. And they published this article about the neck, and they brought me down to London. So that was me hooked. I thought, I like this. It was the first time I felt a sense of achievement, having my words in print. And I went on from there. I've written screenplays, I've written short stories, I've written short films, and obviously I've written books. I've got right now 6 published books, of which Jungle Days is the most recent.
Yeah, you talked there about Maggie Thatcher's Britain and the loss of a sense of community, and also sectarianism in Edinburgh. I remember the 80s as dark, because I'm 54, so I was young growing up. I remember the posters going up for the hunger strikers on all the poles. I remember the after dark processions. I remember protests on the Bridge of Peace. I remember the Gibraltar killings. I remember the coffins going through the town. Yeah. I remember unemployment.
Yes.
High unemployment. I remember everybody, when they finished school, emigrating, be it to the States. Australia wasn't really on the cards then. The States, if you were lucky, but most people went to London or the Greater London area, where my brothers went, and that was where. It's funny you should say Edinburgh. The first thing my brother sent me home from Reading was the London #1 Celtic Supporters Club, and the Edinburgh #1 Supporters Club, because he'd met someone from Edinburgh, and he started to travel up to games, and then he kind of ignited Celtic in me. Up till then, we were watching our League of Ireland team, Drogheda United, and going to see Ireland, and they were dark days as well until Jack Charlton came along and lifted the nation. So the 80s is very it does remind me of a dark time. But when I think back to my time following Celtic, you're going into the late 80s. The centenary season was the first season I really took notice of Celtic, and the lift. That double Frank McAvenny's goals in Hampden gave to people. I can only imagine, 86 and some of the other adventures in the 80s that you would have took as a young boy into your teens.
Yeah.
It must have been incredible. As you say, it was where you felt wanted.
Well, that was the whole point. That's the whole point of Celtic. I don't know if that's kind of become less a factor in the thinking of people who go and see Celtic today, but certainly in my time, you were there as part of a cause. It wasn't just a football team. It's not just a football team. It's, to my mind, it's a cultural and political institution because of its unique history and the unique circumstances surrounding its establishment in 1887, 88. And in the 80s, again, the backdrop was the Troubles. That was the soundtrack to our lives. Every other day, every other week, there'd be news of another bomb or another atrocities committed by all sides. And the thing about Celtic was a repository of unbridled support for the Irish Republican movement. Not necessarily everything the Irish Republic that was done in the name of the Irish Republican movement, but we understood, certainly the core Celtic support that inhabited the Jungle, the iconic stadium. I don't know if you ever went to the Jungle in your own Celtic journey. It was just the defiance of the convention that came from there, the rebel songs, the pride in being Celtic, the pride in being of Irish descent, the pride in Celtic's history. That was something to experience. I don't know if I do it justice because it was just so transcendent when you were there. You got a sense of power that was intoxicating for a young kid like me from my background. And you touch upon the dark decade of the 80s. I totally agree with that. I grew up in a culture of low expectations. My first job was a YOP scheme, which is a forerunner of the infamous YTS that a lot of the early young footballers went through, youth training scheme. It was called the Youth Opportunities Programme, getting paid £18.50, just government-funded slave labour. So I grew up thinking that, I need to escape this. And part of that escape was Celtic on a psychological, spiritual level. It helped me to cope with the darkness that you describe. I grew up in a family that was riven by money problems. My father was in and out of prison. My mum was an alcoholic. There was a lot of anger. There was a lot of sense of impending doom on a daily basis. Bills coming through the door, brown letters. So growing up like that, you needed as a kid a sanctuary, and that was Celtic. And so, as I say in the book, when I stepped onto that Celtic supporters bus, I moved from being part of one family into being part of another. And the guys would look after me, the working class heroes, Harkey and Big Tam guys that gave me an early understanding of what Celtic represented. And really, in many ways, taught me what it was like, what it meant to be a man. That was how important these guys were to me. And I wanted to pay tribute to those men, They're lost to the mists of time, but there'll be stories like this from young kids like me who grew up in the 80s supporting Celtic in every Celtic supporters bus. I don't know if this bus still exists. One Celtic supporters bus that always struck me was the Yogi Bear bus that came down from Aberdeen. And they had a fantastic bus. They had this sort of Yogi Bear, image in the windows and stuff like that. It was just a wonderful time in the midst of the darkness that you described so pertinently. Celtic was a beacon. And I think the club's main players understood that. Tommy Burns, Davy Provan, Paul Grant, they understood what Celtic meant. It was more than just a football team. And they went out with this ethos that they just happened to be Celtic supporters who got lucky to play for the club that they supported. And that came through on the pitch. And I don't know if that passion's there the same. And I mean, it's wonderful to see the influx of overseas players. Some get the club, some less so than others. But in the 80s, you still had on a majority basis, homegrown players that understood the deeper meaning of the team. And as I say, that came through on the pitch, that they were willing to run hither and thither for the cause. And then there was a wonderful synergy between those, what was going on the pitch and what was going on in the terraces, especially, as I mentioned in the book, The Jungle, which was the beating heart of Celtic in those days. I'm sure you will agree. So Celtic, through thick and thin, has always been there. Obviously, they have their troubles. We're going through a recent sticky patch when it comes to the board and the lack of activity in the transfer market. But I just ask Celtic supporters to just consider what the club really means. I know on an objective basis, when you're there on a weekly, it's just another football team, but it really is not. And this is what, as I say, I tried to cement in the book. I hope I've managed to succeed in doing that.
What age were you when, because you're a boy in the beginning of the book, but you say, you know, when you stepped on the bus, you felt like a man. So was it your first drink? Was it your first, you know, listening to stories that maybe you wouldn't have heard at home? Was it that kind of older brother stuff, or was it just the whole package? This is me. This is where I want to be.
Oh yeah, that was exactly it. You just nailed it. So one of the seminal games I went to, 1980 was a huge year for me for Celtic. I started going to see Celtic in the late 70s. In 1977, my older brother Rab, sadly no longer with us, he was a Celtic fan, so he would take me to the games when Celtic played in Edinburgh against Hibs or Hearts. It was at 14 that I started going to the games on my own, and obviously the momentous game that I started the book was this 1980 Scottish Cup final against Rangers, with the fighting on the pitch after the game. Celtic won in extra time, 1-0 with a George McCluskey goal. But the Sammy Nelson testimonial, my mother, I remember, I had to I was pleading with my mum to let me go. It was an overnight bus trip, leaving Edinburgh, Haymarket, on the Tuesday night, late Tuesday night, about 11 o'clock at night. The game in London was on the Wednesday evening. And my brother Rab came home early from the pub. He worked on the rigs at the time, so he was home on 2-week leave, and he came home early, and he really laid it down. He says, listen, man, the boys in the bus will look after him. And that's exactly what happened. The boys in the bus, they had a duty of care. And it wasn't officially said. You know, there was a couple of youngsters on the bus, but I was one of them. But they took care of us, you know. They were hard with us at times, you know. They wouldn't take any nonsense, but, you know, just the ribaldry, the banter. But it was also a political education, because they understood the history of the club, and it was almost like they were passing on that knowledge to the next generation when we're going to games and coming home from games. So I had some wonderful conversations with some of these older guys. God bless them.
It's funny you should say, you know, you're put in the bus and you were looked after. I'm travelling next week to Rotterdam with a good friend, Dean Leddy. And Dino, I remember Dino's mammy coming to the bus and handing them to Hilly, who ran our bus when we were running the bus. He's the chairman of our club. And she gave him into his care as a young, maybe 13 or 14-year-old. He was put even younger maybe. He was put in the front seat in the bus, and he was looked after. He's now a season ticket holder. Celtic is part of his life. You know, his kids' life. Everything is, you know, generational. Even though football has moved on considerably. Yeah. And it's funny you should say you were first taken to Hibs and Hearts games, and you're a Celtic supporter growing up in Edinburgh. So kind of a two-pointed question. One is, did you get much hassle for being a Celtic fan from Hibs fans who were traditionally from an Irish background? And the second thing I want to ask is, I spoke to Willie McStay. I had lunch with Willie a couple of weeks ago. He was in the local area here scouting players, and one of the stadiums he picked out was Tynecastle, and he said how dangerous it was to play in it. And he joked about darts and bottles, and he says, and that was only thrown at the players. So it was a different time to watch football.
Tynecastle was always a hostile environment for Celtic. It was only, apart from the Old Firm games, this was the most fervent match in terms of what was going on the pitch and off the pitch. There was always fighting. Celtic would take over the Shed, which was the iconic Hearts terracing. And I remember there'd be a line of police between Celtic fans and the Hearts fans who'd been pushed to the Wheatfield Road end or whatever. No, we were in the Wheatfield Road end, the other end of the stadium. And there was always trouble with Hearts, and it was very hostile. But I write in the book, when I used to arrive in the number 2 or the number 1 bus or the 21 bus from where I lived into Gorgie, which was only like a 10-minute journey, and you just see the Holy Gorgie taken over by Celtic fans. It was something to see. You know, they're drinking their lager, and this was the days in the 70s when the scarves were tied round the wrist and so on. So Hearts was a hostile environment. I didn't get much stick. I mean, obviously Hibs has an Irish history, but Hibs by this time had sublimated their Irishness in order, in their view, to appeal to a broader mass, a broader base of support. Something that Celtic fans should know, I'm sure many do know, but there'll be others who do not, is Hibs were the inspiration behind Celtic's foundation. Hibs formed in 1875 St Patrick's Church in the Cowgate, the area where James Connolly, the iconic Irish rebel and trade unionist, grew up in his formative years. And Hibs was so committed to its Irishness and Catholicism that not only did you have to be a Catholic to play for the team, you had to be a mass attending practicing one. Obviously, they changed that. Celtic went to a different identity, which was anybody can play for Celtic, regardless of creed, race, religion, etc., which I think was a fantastic decision made, a seminal meeting that took place when this was discussed. So I never saw Hibs. A lot of people say, why do you not support Hibs? And I said, well, I never saw Hibs as a club that catered to my needs and my sense of Irishness through my mother's side. Because Hibs, as I say, had sublimated. But interestingly, that identity is starting to creep back into the Hibs support. We saw that a section of the Hibs support, for example, booed the minute silence recently for Remembrance Day, as Celtic fans do. In my view, rightly. We can get into that. That's obviously a bone of contention. I don't know why the authorities keep trying to force Celtic to observe this minute silence, given the history of Irish people with the British Army. It seems to me myopic at best and ignorant at worst and a provocation. But that's another story. So no, I never really got a lot of criticism in that way. I think I did feel a little bit of hostility, going around the scheme, because I really embraced the Celtic identity. I was very defiant. Being a supporter of Celtic gave me a sense of my own strength, and I started to fight back. I wouldn't take it anymore. And I credit being a supporter of Celtic with that. It gave me a sense of pride that I was not some alien other. I mean, we can talk about the history of migration. We're seeing that today with the hysteria over immigration. And that's why I feel so strongly about the role of the Green Brigade as today's beating heart of Celtic, and the way that they are being mistreated by the board. And I know that not every Celtic fan agrees with the Green Brigade. I do. I think they understand the history of Celtic, and they are the modern day Jungle in that regard. More power to them.
Yeah, they do. They do split the fan base, but no one can deny the politics, and no one can deny the social conscience. Yeah, they bring an atmosphere to the ground that can be lost sometimes in seated stadiums. Themselves and the boys in the other corner, they're hoping to get a standing section for both of the as demand grows for standing section. They're hoping to get a bigger standing section behind the goals, but one that the boys can join. But yeah, that probably is a conversation for another day, because the book, as we said, is about the 80s, and you mentioned the number of players now. I do agree with you that I don't think players who come in from other places, if you're born into it, it's embedded into you. And like, with the exception of Maurice Johnson, no Celtic fan was going to sign for Rangers, no matter what money he was getting. You look at Kieran Tierney, a fantastic player, back at Celtic now, but no one would deny that he moved for to get I suppose financial security at Arsenal. But the likes of Paul McStay, he'd been offered so many moves, and he stayed so loyal to. He
was one of the last one-club players in Scottish football, maybe British football entire. I misnamed Peter Grant, not Paul Grant. Peter Grant was a player that springs to mind. He had limitations, but his heart was that of a Celtic lion. I mean, he would have walked through fire for Celtic. Roy Aitken was another one that stands out. Players who moved to Celtic but embraced Celtic. I mentioned Davy Provan. He was actually a Rangers supporter. There's been a few cases. Kenny Dalglish is an obvious other example. One player who gets a lot of stick today and did then, and I find that lamentable because he was fantastic in his point, was Charlie Nicholas. He played in that testimonial against Arsenal at the old Highbury for Sammy Nelson. Fantastic, had a fantastic game. And when he went to sign for Arsenal in '83, and it was simply about money. He was a Celtic man. He grew up, he came up through the boys' club. And And this was the era where of the biscuit tin of the board being very parsimonious with the money. And they felt, as Adam Bray in the book, that even putting on a Celtic jersey is compensation in and of itself. Well, that's okay, maybe at the early days in your career, but then you get married, you have kids, and you're starting to think about, I need to plan for the future. And football is notoriously short career. One thing that was a real travesty was that Billy McNeill was one of the poorest paid managers in the league. I think he was the fourth best paid manager in the Scottish League at the time. So the board would take advantage of the loyalty of the players. And obviously they waive the history of the Lisbon Lions and John Thompson and all the rest, Brother Walford. And I understand that. But if you're making so much, the Celtic wasn't a rich club in the 80s. It had financial problems. I mean, the average gate at Parkhead, apart from when they played Rangers or they played a big European game against Real Madrid in 1980 as they did, was about 18 to 22,000, and people never had any money because of Thatcher's free market revolution. People were unemployed, as you mentioned. People were struggling to make ends meet. And so it was a really challenging time for all football clubs, but certainly for a club the size of Celtic, whose fan base had higher expectations because of the history of the Lisbon Lions and the glory days of the Quality Street Gang. And they were gone. And so the players that were in the Celtic, I wouldn't say there were that many world-class players in the 80s, but there were certainly players who, compared to today, would give their all for the team. And you've got to remember, it was a different game in the 80s. It was slower tempo. But even within that, Celtic had some wonderful players. I mean, that third goal against St Mirren, the iconic game at Love Street when they won the league in 86, had to win 5-0. Front to back, if you watch that on YouTube, it stands up today. It was world class. And the pitches were a different order in the 80s. They were terrible. By this time of year, you were playing in ploughed fields. So the players had to take note of that. They had to be cognizant of that when they passed the ball and when they received the ball. So I would say that the individual skill level was perhaps better than today, but the game's obviously much faster now. It's all about how many kilometres you run, data analysis, and how many metres you cover of the pitch in a single game, and everybody has to press. And so on. In those days, it wasn't so much like that. You had your players who had different positions and different roles, players that could turn on the magic, players who were there to deliver the ball, defend. I mean, the 80s, I feel so lucky that I still got to see Danny McGrain motoring up and down that left flank, that right flank. What a sight that was to see. So, the game was more physical as well. You were still allowed to tackle, which I think, sadly, has become diminished in this new era of health and safety. Players were tougher mentally, tougher physically. So, in many ways, the 80s was the last high point of Scottish football in that regard. The game was much more of a man's game, if I can use that term, without being castigated. And the players would put on a shift and they would be happy to do so for very low wages compared to today, even in relative terms.
You named two players there, David Potter, the late David Potter, the great writer and author who is you're with Pitch Publishing for this book, and David had a number of books with Pitch Publishing. David was a regular on the podcast and a regular contributor to the fanzine for many, many years. But David always spoke about when Kenny Dalglish left for Liverpool, that was the start of the end of the great era of Celtic because the board were cashing in. And his dad always thought Charlie Nicholas was one of the greatest players he ever saw. And again, when he left, it was felt that the club were cashing in. But obviously Charlie wanted to make the money as well. So there's two players that you mentioned, and a list of players that came through from the 70s right through to the 80s. And then obviously some of them were still around in the 90s when the old board were finally removed and a new era came in. But it seems that the modern day player now and the modern day fan, and I include myself in that at times, we want more than Scotland because Celtic have been such a dominant force in it. But back in the 80s, the early 80s, Celtic was still competing in the late part of Europe, and then that was it. Then Europe was, these players had moved on, and Europe was kind of beyond Celtic then. Like, as Michael Pringle said recently on the podcast, you didn't need much money to go into Europe because we would normally be out after 1 or 2 games.
Yeah.
So, but now, because of the way they structure football, us as fans, we want more. But if we want more, we have to pay more. So football is not as simple a game anymore as it was. It's still, as Matt O'Neill said, it's sometimes coaches complicate it, but I think we are guilty as well of demanding, to be better and to be. And I'm not saying we don't deserve it, but when you look at the wealth outside Scotland, it's incredible. It's hard to compete.
No, it's impossible, actually. I mean, if you look at the broadcast, the TV money that goes into the English game compared to the Scottish game, it's night and day. So Celtic have to be cleverer in terms of the recruitment. They have to look further afield. I mean, when Ange was in the hot seat, he accessed his contacts in the Japanese game to bring over some great players. They have to look further afield. They have to be much more inventive with their scouting. Celtic's always had a strong affinity with Ireland. As I say in the book, I think Celtic is an Irish institution that happens to be located in Scotland. And so they've ploughed a very prosperous furrow there in terms of recruitment and scouting. Youth policies are no longer the same as they were. The youth Celtic had a famously wonderfully advanced youth policy. Some fantastic world-class players that came through the academy. That doesn't seem to be any longer the case. I don't know if that's more of a social issue with regards to how kids are no longer playing football to the extent they were in previous epochs and generations. But in the 80s, you've got to remember the Scottish League was hyper competitive compared to now. I mean, you had McLean's Dundee United were fantastic. Ferguson's Aberdeen were fantastic. Both of these teams had success in Europe. They were called the New Firm for a reason. They won the league. And I remember at the high point in the mid-80s, if you went to Pittodrie or even at Parkhead and you got a draw with Aberdeen, you thought that was a good result. That's how good Aberdeen were. They had some wonderful players, Strachan and Willie Miller and, brilliant Alex McLeish, John Houghton. They had a fantastic team from front to back, Neil Cooper. So they were hard to compete against. So the Scottish League was itself in the ascendancy. And of course, 86, when English teams got barred from Europe after the Heysel disaster, that's when Souness was able to capitalise when he came in to manage Rangers. And all this influx of English internationalists came up to play for Rangers. That transformed the game as well. And Celtic struggled to adapt to that reality. Rangers were the first team under the auspices of David Murray, who was very cavalier with money, and he would buy success. He wouldn't wait for players to be developed from the youth. And Celtic stayed to that old model. And the fact that they could win the double in 88 is a tremendous achievement, given that it took place in that context of the Souness Revolution. So that we still had our moments, but I think there's been a real lack of imagination and inventiveness from succeeding boards, and I think that holds true to this day, sadly. I think there is an understanding that the board has traditionally taken the fan base for granted because of the attachment and the affinity that Celtic fans have for the club. And I think that's something needs to change, because at this moment in time, as it was in the 80s, Celtic was starting to be left behind. And when it came to the understanding of how football fitted into the wider context of society and what fans could reasonably expect from their teams. And you're right, again, the Lisbon Lions have been an inspiration, but also a curse for succeeding Celtic teams, because that's the benchmark, isn't it? That wonderful day in Portugal when Celtic beat the best team in Europe on paper, Milan and Inter Milan, and the way they did it, and that Celtic team was playing total football before the term was invented by Cruyff with his great Dutch international team in the early 1970s. The '74 World Cup in Germany being of particular significance when it came to that. So we've suffered because of that, the Lisbon Lions, in some ironic way. Obviously, we don't deny that. It's a wonderful period. We are rightly proud of what was achieved. But since then, it's never been replicated. But I think it's not so much that there's a lack of willingness to try and replicate it. The board today, if I'm going to mount some defence, they'll have the historical memory of the days when Celtic came close to going into receivership in the early 1990s because of the mismanagement of funds. and until Fergus McCann came along and changed and saved the club in 1994. And his economic model of financial stability and being able to steward the club in a very conservative, careful way remains extant within the board to this day. I think unnecessarily so. I think last year the club had 70 million profit in its coffers. So, a football club is not a normal business. And I think there's always been this dynamic tension between those in the club who see it as a business first and foremost, and those that see it as a football club. And even within that, even among the founding fathers, Brother Walfred and people on his side of the argument, they saw Celtic as a deeper thing than just a revenue-generating mechanism. Where you had the money men like John Glass, he was responsible for professionalising the club. And he used to refer to those like Brother Walfred or those who came after him who still adhered to the founding principles of Celtic is to put to fill the dinner tables of the poor in East End of Glasgow as dinner table cranks. He saw them as being, they were living in an alternative reality. And if Celtic was going to thrive, it had to professionalise. And that's what he brought into the club. So there's always been this dynamic tension, first and foremost within the board, but not no longer within the board. The dynamic tension now is between the board and the fans regarding expectations, regarding what by what metric can Celtic be considered to be successful. Winning the Scottish League after Scottish League, you're like, we're so used to that now. It's a great thing, but there's a feeling that Celtic is too big for Scottish football now, and that's lamentable because this is where Celtic grew up. This is where Celtic had its success. This is where many generations of players played the game. But there's for many Celtic fans, they're looking further afield. There's obviously been muted talks of an all UK competition, whether cup or league. But I think Europe is where Celtic fans say that the club should be more ambitious when it comes to try to make an impact.
Yeah, I think that the European Super League, as they spoke about, has already been...
it's come and gone.
But yet we still have a Champions League that they changed to fit that European Super League.
Yeah.
And last year, I have to say, it was fantastic. Big nights at Celtic Park, big away trips. It was really, really enjoyable. We didn't expect to win it. Getting out of the league stage, we went to Bayern Munich and we had a magnificent performance. We pushed them close. They were not the best team in it, but we saw progress. And I think as a fan, that's all we want to see. We want to see progress and development. But when we don't see it, I find with the current board that it's like being on a wheel. We get to the Champions League, we do well. We sell our players, which is part of the system. Then we have a poor qualification campaign, and then we're in the Europa League. Interest drops off. There's fan unrest. There's protests. And then there's a few more pamper in, and we're back building again to be in the Champions League instead of looking at the Bruges model and the likes of Bodo Glimt, who are progressive teams progressing in Europe. And there's not one fan that I know will tell you, "Oh, I want Celtic to win the Champions League," but they want to be competitive in it. And that's and I don't think the board. Maybe they're too prudent, or maybe Dermot just pulls too many strings. But I feel that we are not progressing under the current board on the pitch.
No, I think Dermot Desmond is like an absentee landlord. He's very rarely at the games. He came out with that withering indictment of Brendan Rodgers, which was completely unprecedented. I don't know if that was ill-judged or not. Clearly, he would have taken legal advice to make sure that it was not actionable, though on the surface it would seem to be actionable. I mean, he really impugned Rodgers' character. I don't think unfairly, but in bygone days Celtic, those kind of things would have been done in-house. They wouldn't have been made public. So there has been a period of real deep discord within Celtic. Martin O'Neill came in and gave the club and the team a fillip. He raised the spirits because of his own brilliant history of the team. But obviously he came a cropper. Wheels sort of came off in that regard for him. With a couple of bad results. So I think we're in a period of stasis. There's a sense that the Celtic have plateaued. and they've come down a level on that mounting of aspiration and ascendancy, that the fans are being conditioned to expect less for less, and that's a terrible thing. There's a sense that the club's identity is not being replicated on the pitch in terms of the way this team plays. Certainly before O'Neill came in, he's tried to bring that back, and he has to some extent. More penetration, more physicality, But we need the players in order to play the Celtic way, and there is a Celtic way of playing football. And it's incredibly effective when it's done well, as we've seen through succeeding generations. We saw it in the 80s, glimpses of it, and we've seen it in Europe. And the problem we have, Andrew, is when the players are not immune to the feeling on the terraces. They can feel the atmosphere. They feed off that. And if they feel that the fans are not happy, that's going to, and I'm not blaming the fans. The fans have got every right to articulate their discord or their disdain with the board. But it leads to a low morale. And the players then don't have belief in themselves. And that is where a good manager comes in. I think Martin O'Neill is a great manager. He obviously is only there for a while. There's still no confirmation of any. We've seen this, the French gentleman with Nancy. It seems like he's no longer going to be in the frame. He went to an advanced stage. And then the Celtic board, I think, decided he wasn't experienced enough to handle a club as big as Celtic. So I don't know who they've got in mind. But they better get their act together soon, because if we come to the January transfer window, what are they going to do? Are they going to give significant funds to an interim manager, Martin O'Neill, to buy new players, knowing that he's going to leave? Will Martin O'Neill, I think that they have to make Martin O'Neill's position clear sooner rather than later to give a sense of stability and surety. Will Martin O'Neill stay till the end of the season? I personally hope he does, because that would give a long period of transition to get a new manager, to draw up a list of prospects, interview them and so on, and really do the due diligence required to get a manager who fits with the team's ethos and traditional playing style. I think Brendan Rodgers was a bad appointment. Second time, I was not for that. I never trusted him. I didn't like the way they left the club the first time. Yes, he had success, but I think the character of the man has always been suspect. I've always seen him as being a mercenary in it for himself, make as much money as he can. And I do think the problem was, by and large, with Brendan Rodgers when he's coming out and lambasting his players in public. That's terrible management. I've never seen a Celtic manager do that in my time following the club. I don't know if you have. So this discord is deep-seated. And unless it's resolved sooner rather than later, it will have far-reaching consequences, I predict.
And in the short term, we have an AGM on Friday, which should be interesting because, as you say, they have been in talks with a manager, and then they've decided for whatever reason he's not coming, or he's decided he's not coming for his reasons. So on top of everything else that's going on, it should make some interesting. The club. They just on that. The club is not being administered properly. All this stuff is coming out in the public. I don't know if people are leaking from within. It sounds like they are, but the Dermot Desmond statement was unprofessional. Maybe he was defending the board. I get that, but I think it was such a withering indictment that you call into question his judgment for appointing Brendan Rodgers second time round. But the fact that all the negotiations with the prospective new manager, they led us up to the top of the hill, and then they led us down again. Everybody's thinking this new guy's coming in and he's progressive, and we're getting his CV and it looks good. And Thierry Henry's giving him an endorsement and so on. You couldn't get any better endorsement than Thierry Henry for this manager. And then suddenly it all withers, it all dissipates. That's been the lived experience of Celtic fans with this board. That it's almost as if they're teasing the fans, and they're struggling with their PR, they're struggling with their level of professionalism, and I don't have confidence in this board being able to steward Celtic's affair going forward. I think there needs to be a root and branch reform. I don't know who could come in. I don't think Celtic fans would be minded. I wouldn't be, for Middle Eastern money to come into the club. But that seems to be the trajectory of travel for many clubs, certainly down south, that the injection of money from other parts of the world. I think Celtic should keep its Irishness at board level. But Dermot Desmond has come out and been ironclad in his refusal to contemplate
backing away from Celtic as being its major shareholder. He's not the biggest shareholder in total, but he holds the largest number of individual shares, 37.5% of shares. So rather than Dermot Desmond coming out and excoriating Brendan Rodgers, it'd be good. I don't think he won't turn up at the AGM, obviously. He should turn up and come out with a plan, a 5-year plan for Celtic that the fans can buy into. That's the least he can do at this stage and at this juncture, and give the fans reason to be hopeful and optimistic going forward. What's the plan for progress on the pitch? We don't want to just hear about how much money the club's making. That's fine. Of course, the club needs to make money. It needs to be financially solvent. But over and above that, what's the plan for investment? We need to invest in the stadium. We need to invest in the infrastructure. We need to have a better relationship between the fans and the board, particularly, as we mentioned earlier, the Green Brigade. There has to be a place for that, the Green Brigade and the club, with their fantastic political statements that they make. Again, we recognise that some Celtic fans think they go too far at times, but I don't. I like the fact that they operate in an ecosystem of reaction, anti-migrant hysteria, racism's on the rise, the genocide in Palestine. I think Celtic fans should have a voice when it comes to these matters, and we're better to do that than a stadium that's associated with the cause of migrants, Irish migrants, the poor and the put upon from inception.
Here. If I had a time machine, and a lot of people have climbed into the Celtic Soul time machine, if I was to go back to the 80s, because I started following Celtic in the centenary season, I would be in Hampden on that sunny day when Frank McAvenny scored those 2 goals after Kevin Gallagher put Dundee United ahead. I would be there. But if you could climb into the time machine, you've wrote the book about the 80s, you've lived the 80s. If you were to climb back into my time machine, what game would that take you back to in the 80s?
The Kilmarnock League match, Celtic won 4-2, when the Irish-American boxer Sean O'Grady made his appearance at half-time. And there was an absolute rammy. This is obviously in the book. And it proved to me Celtic's identity as an Irish institution when push comes to almighty shove. Sean O'Grady was in Scotland. He was fighting the then lightweight champion John Wight at the old Kelvin Hall in Glasgow. And his team had approached the Celtic board asking to help promote the fight. Could Sean O'Grady, given his Irish-American ancestry and heritage from Texas, make an appearance on the pitch at half-time? This was an otherwise run-of-the-mill league game. The jungle was packed as usual. The fans were milling around, going to the lavy, going to for a pee and, getting their pies or whatever. And suddenly it was announced that this Irish-American was coming on, this guy was coming on the pitch. He came on with a big 10-gallon hat and he had a denim jacket and jeans. And everybody, who is this kid, And he took off his jacket and he had a Celtic top. And the jungle erupted into the most powerful rendition of a soldier song that I've ever heard in all my time. And it caused this was a time when the away fans got a decent allocation, and the Kilmarnock fans kicked off in the sort of their section of the what was then called the Rangers end, because Celtic fans were supporting an Irish-American boxer over a home-grown boxer in the shape of Jim Watt. That's proved to me that Celtic is situated in Scotland, but we're an Irish institution situated in Scotland because of the history of migration from Ireland to the west coast of Scotland in particular, and obviously other parts of Scotland, but primarily the west coast of Scotland for geographical reasons. That was a stunning revelation to me, So I think most Celtic fans have been able to operate to a dual identity, Scottish but of Irish descent. And a lot of people in Scotland don't like that. And still to this day, that's resented. That's why I think Celtic occupies a special place as a club of immigrants who grew up in a hostile environment and produced a stunning institution that has had such an impact, not only in Scotland, but all over the world. Wherever you go in the world, there are Celtic supporters clubs. I lived in Los Angeles for a number of years in the early 90s, Andrew. And I'd go and see Celtic games there was a Celtic supporters club. There is a Celtic supporters club in Los Angeles. There is in every city in the United States, Canada, Australia, South Africa, you name it. And I would go routinely down to this pub, and you'd be there at 7 a.m. to watch the game live. And you're walking in this Irish pub, and it'd be like walking into a pub in East Kilbride or anywhere in Dublin or wherever, just the raucous Celtic fans. And so Celtic is a club of universal values. That's why the club is so important. And that's why its stewardship is so important. And that's why the fan base is of a different order of, I think, political and historical consciousness than most other football fan bases all over the world.
Yeah, I've goosebumps pimples here when you mentioned the Soldier Song, and then obviously you flipped it. You went and lived in America, and Joe Cook, a good friend of mine, is still in LA and still watching the games. Obviously, the Ireland game, he texted me. He was watching at 6 a.m. in the morning in LA. So yeah, it's Celtic is certainly a worldwide brand. Where can we get the book?
Wherever you get your books, it's available far and wide. Amazon, Waterstones, any good bookshop. It's readily available. I hope it sparks a discussion. I like to think the book goes into the whys of Celtic rather than just stays at the level of the whats. It's not a season by season account of football. It blends personal memoir, history, obviously what was going on the pitch, but also the politics that were the wider context and the backdrop to the 1980s, that most tempestuous and turbulent of decades, and I argue the most impactful decade and consequential of the post-war era, still to this day, for the reasons that we've gone into, and probably other reasons as well, which are in the book. I hope people enjoy it. As I say, I hope it sparks a conversation amongst the Celtic faithful as to the identity of the club and what the club stands for. I think in these trying times on the pitch and off the pitch, when it comes to the boardroom, such an understanding is more necessary than ever.
Well, it's a lovely read. It's a beautiful read because it takes me back to those trips and to those games with you before my time following Celtic. But it also dips in and out of our history and the politics behind the club. So I highly recommend the book to our listeners and readers, and we'll put some links in and put some stuff in the fanzine and so forth. That book is out in Pitch Publishing. John, thank you so much.
Been an absolute pleasure, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Hail, hail.